Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to be traveling back to ancient Greece, but we're deliberately going to skip the big spotlight, Athenian democracy. Instead, we're plunging into the political reality that was, well, arguably far more common across the city-states. Oligarchy, the rule by a select few.
That's right. I mean, Athens gets all the glory, but oligarchy was really the dominant model. It profoundly shapes the ancient world. So our mission today is to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding the complex machinery of this system. We're going to unpack how these elites, whether their power came from land or from trade, how they organize communities, maintain control, and why those dynamics of leadership and privilege, still echo today.
And to start, we really have to look at how these systems were even born. Oligarchy wasn't the original model, was it?
Not at all. It replaced hereditary monarchy in a lot of places during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE.
So what was the big shift?
The fundamental shift was, well, it was revolutionary. Power was no longer just about birthright. It moved to those who controlled quantifiable wealth, specifically land.
Okay, so it's all about land ownership.
At first, yes. And it's fascinating to see what was happening economically that diminished the king. As populations grew and colonization took off, the king's traditional lands just became less important.
Compared to what?
Compared to specialized farmland and the huge fortunes being made offshore. So the king, who's relying on, inherited loyalty, he finds his authority just weakening as these new rich families pop up whose power is purely from capital.
So the transition wasn't just a political reshuffle, it was an economic revolution.
Yeah.
But that new land-based system, it didn't last long, right? Because the economy kept changing.
It did, and this is where it gets highly dynamic. Maritime expansion, flourishing trade routes. These became massive disruptive forces.
So the next disruption wasn't military, it was commerce.
Exactly. If the first oligarchy was built on the stability of land.
Which is predictable.
Right. This second wave was defined by the instability of commerce.
And that must have created some seismic tension. I mean, you have this new merchant class popping up in port cities. Corinth, Rhodes.
Miletus, yeah. And suddenly, the traditional landowning aristocracy, the old money, they have serious competition.
They're being challenged by these commercially successful merchants.
Who have vast amounts of liquid capital, but, and this is the key, they lack the old aristocratic pedigree.
And the political rights that went with it.
Exactly. So the harbors, they rapidly become these critical political hubs. Economic influence and social status just get all tangled up.
So you have the land-based elites, whose whole identity is tied to their ancestral farms.
And they're watching as this new merchant class basically dictates prices and controls the flow of all the cool imported goods. The tension becomes palpable. I mean, the big question is, should the old money make room for the new money?
And the city-states all reacted differently to that question, which had huge consequences for their stability.
They did. Some oligarchies, they were strategic, they saw the writing on the wall, they broadened their representation to include the wealthy middle class, they effectively co-opted them.
Yeah.
But others were rigid. They just excluded them completely, kept commercial wealth firmly out of the formal power structures.
And that rigidity, our analysis shows, was a massive destabilizing factor.
Oh, a huge one. We see these striking examples, like in Megara and Sicyon, where that exclusion just boils over into massive civic upheaval because the excluded wealthy, they felt they had nothing to lose by funding a revolution.
Which just demonstrates that inherent instability, doesn't it? When the rules are all based on exclusion. Okay, so if you weren't an elite, not old money, not new money, what was civic life like for you? How did the average citizen interact with the machinery of governance?
Formally, they didn't. Authority rested entirely with the wealthy few. You had government councils composed exclusively of this elite. They managed everything.
Laws, taxes, war.
All of it. And crucially, voting rights were almost universally tied to property ownership.
So if you're an artisan, a farmer, a laborer, you are systematically excluded. Formally. But you mentioned collective bargaining earlier. That sounds, I don't know, surprisingly modern. If the elites held all the cards legally, why wouldn't they just ignore those demands?
Because the rule of the few, though it was powerful, was entirely dependent on the willing participation of the many.
Ah, okay.
Oligarchs needed that broader support for two essential things: military manpower and economic stability. You need those farmers to harvest the food. You need the laborers to build the walls.
So that dependence gave the non-elites some leverage, even without a vote.
That's their leverage. So they used these subtle, informal channels to exercise what little power they had.
Let's talk about one of those, the patron-client relationship. It sounds like an early form of political trade.
It absolutely was. I mean, non-elites relied heavily on these relationships. For a common farmer, the exchange was very concrete. He'd trade his loyalty, his labor, maybe his family's military service.
And in return?
In return, the patron, the rich elite, would make sure his taxes were waived during a bad harvest, or maybe offer legal protection in a dispute.
So it was a social contract, but not one enforced by law.
Exactly. It's enforced by reciprocal favor. It gave the average citizen a way to deal with hardship outside the formal legal system.
So while policy is being shaped by the few in the council rooms, they're constantly looking over their shoulder at the silent majority. It sounds like a really delicate, tense balance.
It was. And the elites knew it, which is why they worked so hard to stabilize it through culture.
Culture. So it's not just laws and councils.
Not at all. Their power wasn't just economic. It was social, religious, ancestral.
Right. This is where that cultural infrastructure of elite power comes in. Leadership wasn't just holding an office. It was deeply intertwined with, kinship and religious duties.
Absolutely. Political authority often passed through bloodlines, and it was cemented by a strategic intermarriage between powerful families.
It really was ruled by a closed, interlocked circle.
And this closed circle used very specific tools to maintain collaboration among themselves and control over everyone else. This is where we have to talk about the heteria.
The what?
The heteria. These were not just casual social clubs. They were exclusive aristocratic fraternities. They were the true backbone of elite strategy.
So these are the backroom deal makers.
Precisely. They'd dine together, away from public view, and plan their political moves. And critically, these clubs were like informal political funding committees.
Oh, interesting.
They decided which promising young elite would get backed for office, how they'd divide up state contracts, and which rival, even within their own class, would be quietly sidelined.
They were the engine of behind-the-scenes governance.
And beyond these secret clubs, they also weaponized faith and tradition to legitimize their rule publicly.
Of course.
Public rituals, religious festivals, they didn't just celebrate the gods, they formalized and legitimized elite authority.
And they'd claimed descent from heroes and gods, right?
All the time. They'd commission poets to craft these heroic genealogies. And hereditary priesthoods just blurred the line between political and spiritual power.
If you control access to the gods, you control a lot.
You control the sacred realm and civic life. Both.
And they made sure everyone knew who was in charge through these grand, very visible displays, sponsoring festivals, games.
This political patronage is crucial. The practice is known as euergetism, being a benefactor.
Doing good deeds.
Right. And when an elite sponsored one of these incredibly expensive events, it wasn't just for fun. It was a strategic demonstration of their wealth, yes, but more importantly, it reinforced their status as generous benefactors of society.
So they were buying public favor.
They were buying public favor and consent, demonstrating virtue and authority at the same time, all without having to share any actual legislative power.
So they paid for the party, and in exchange, they earned the right to run the country.
A pretty good deal for them. But these power structures did not go unchallenged.
And this is where the Greeks were so good, right? Creating public forums where the system itself was openly dissected.
Exactly. I mean, Athenian theater, even in a state that was often flirting with oligarchy, it became this cultural battleground for examining power.
You had comedy with figures like Aristophanes.
Using just razor-sharp satire to expose elite hypocrisy, mock their extravagance.
And then tragedy explored the moral costs of it all with such depth.
Tragedians like Sophocles and Antigone or Euripides in The Suppliant Women,
Yeah.
they used the stage not just for entertainment, but to articulate these early democratic values.
Asking these huge questions in a massive public forum.
Yeah, like what is the moral burden of absolute power?
And then, beyond the stage, you have the philosophers, who offered maybe the sharpest, most enduring critiques of wealth-based rule.
This is so essential for our deep dive. You have Plato in the Republic, who focuses intensely on the mechanics of its inevitable corruption.
He's the one who warned that oligarchy divides society into what he famously called two cities, the rich and the poor.
And this is where the insight really deepens. For Plato, the problem was this fundamental error of defining success purely by money. He argued that the insatiable desire for wealth just corrupts the state. The ruling class shifts its focus from public service to private gain.
And when money replaces virtue as the measure of leadership.
The oligarch becomes avaricious, incapable of resisting corruption. And that greed, Plato says, inevitably leads to the collapse of the state.
And Aristotle, he agreed on the instability part, but he came at it from a slightly different angle in his politics.
He did. Aristotle saw oligarchy as this unstable hybrid, ruled by the few, but crucially only for their own benefit. His core critique was that oligarchies mistake wealth for wisdom.
A flawed premise.
A deeply flawed premise. The idea that just because you're rich, you're automatically qualified to rule. And because wealth accumulation becomes the only goal of government, the common good is just neglected. Which, he says, sows deep resentment and guarantees, eventually, a revolution.
Wow. That analysis remains strikingly relevant. So what does all this mean for us today? The parallels between those ancient struggles and, modern debates about wealth inequality, corporate influence, they're profound.
They really are. The underlying mechanisms of imbalance are startlingly similar across millennia.
Ancient power came from land and trade.
Today, it comes from capital, technology, media platforms. But the challenge is the same. Modern democracies are wrestling with how concentrated wealth influences decisions made behind closed doors.
So whether it's the head of a dining club funding a candidate,
Or a modern super PAC, the method of control by the few is analogous.
and the practical lessons from these ancient struggles are so clear, the things the Greeks tried to implement to stop that slide.
Exactly. They explored solutions like mandated transparency, public accountability to prevent corruption,
Rotating leadership to disrupt those entrenched power structures.
and crucially, maintaining open civic spaces, places to encourage robust debate and to balance the influence of wealth.
So the core message is really enduring.
Absolutely. The mechanisms of ancient oligarchy economic dominance, restricted participation, careful narrative control, they still echo powerfully in contemporary systems of privilege. The Greeks recognized the inherent dangers of imbalance a long, long time ago. They warned that leadership without accountability just breeds division and ultimately destroys the state.
Absolutely. The philosophers worry that oligarchies collapse when wealth replaces virtue. So considering everything we've unpacked today, from those strategic dining clubs to the warnings of Plato, here's a final thought. What enduring virtue beyond the acquisition of capital must modern leadership prioritize to ensure sustainable governance and prevent the kind of political fragmentation Plato warned about? We encourage you to reflect on that question.